So the things that I'll tell you are things as I best remember them. If I quote Reich, it may not be an exact quotation, because over a long period of time things get distorted. But I'll give you my best memories. I'll tell you first how I came to ergonomy and how I got to Reich. A man who was a scholar in this city when I was in medical school said to me, he knew I was interested in psychiatry, and he said to me, I've read a book that I think you'd be interested in. And I said, what is it? And he said, Sexual Revolution by Wilhelm Reich. And I said, oh, that guy, he's a nut. And he said, how do you know he's a nut? I said, everybody knows he's nuts. And he said, don't you think you might read a book before you call a man a nut? So that was reasonable. So I read Sexual Revolution. And to people who read Sexual Revolution in this day, it is not as much a magnificent opening of the mind as it was when I read it, which was probably in the very early 40s. And at that time, I was considering going into psychoanalysis. And I had been shopping around for an analyst in the city. And I had taken courses and had gone to lectures. And of the people who were psychoanalysts whom I knew, I hadn't yet found one that I would entrust myself to. And when I read Sexual Revolution, there were the answers to so many questions that I had raised in my coursework and hadn't gotten reasonable, straightforward answers to. So Sexual Revolution was a mind opener to me. And thereafter, I read all of Reich's books that were available. And by the time I had finished reading them, I thought, this is the man to whom I want to go for therapy. So I called Reich, and he was in Forest Hills at that time. And we arranged an appointment. And I must tell you, of all the things that I read, the only thing that didn't sit too well with me was the concept of orgone energy. Because having been trained in classical science, orgone energy was a wild concept. So I had planned to go see Reich and to keep any mention of orgone energy out of the conversation, because the therapy I knew made sense and I wanted to get into therapy with him. So I came to his office at Forest Hills on the appointed day, and my first sight of Reich, he came down from the second floor stairway, and the feeling that one got was, this man is powerful, just from the way he walked down the stairs. You had a feeling he was a powerhouse. So he first asked me, how did you get to me? What have you read? And I told him that I'd read all that was available at that time. And his second question was, what do you think of orgone energy? And I said, well, it seems very strange to me. And he said, of course it does. He said, because you've been trained in a way that's entirely different from the the way I think and the way that orgone energy research is directed. And if you ever get that far, you'll work in the laboratory, you'll do the experiments, and you'll find out for yourself whether orgone energy exists or not. And I thought that was a very reasonable response, because somehow I'd expected him to say, you don't believe in orgone energy, then get the hell out of here. But he was very reasonable about it. So we started therapy, and one of the provisions of his therapy was, you can quit anytime you want, or I can kick you out anytime I want, which I thought was reasonable also. So we started therapy, and it was immediately apparent to me what a powerful technique this was. You know, no one who has not been in therapy can really fully appreciate the power of the therapy. You must have experienced it in order to really know what it does. And I can remember most sessions at Forest Hills, each time that I left a therapeutic session and was walking toward the subway, I felt like I had never remembered feeling. I was flying. And therapy became much more important to me than I assumed that it would, because so far as I knew, I was not in bad shape emotionally. And the reason I was pursuing therapy was mostly for training purposes, because I believe that anyone who goes into psychiatry should have been in therapy. So I had a kind of academic approach to therapy, but being in orgone therapy, one's mind is quickly changed. Like things happen that you never anticipated happening to you. So in general, it was a very electrifying experience. Halfway through my therapy, Reich moved to Oregon in Maine. And he said, I'm going to move to Maine. Do you want to go to another therapist down around here? And I said, oh no, I'm going to Maine. So, about halfway through my therapy, I went every other week. I would drive up on Friday night. At that time, the roads were nothing like the superhighways that there are now going up to Maine. They were terrible roads. And I would drive all through the night on Friday and get to Oregon, or the area, at about 6 o'clock in the morning, sleep for about 2 hours, and then go for a session on Saturday morning, and then go for another session on Sunday morning, and then drive home. And in the middle of winter time, when people from down here couldn't drive on the roads, people from Maine could drive in that kind of snow, but we couldn't. So then I used to fly to Augusta and hitchhike up to Oregon, because there were always lumber trucks going along, so you could always hitch a ride up to Oregon. And I always considered it an adventure. I never looked forward with any kind of apprehension about the fact, oh, now I have to go up to Maine. I always looked forward to the weekend that I went up to Maine, no matter what the weather. And when one has a patient who lives 30 miles away, who says the weather's too bad, you know, I can't come today, I feel like you don't deserve therapy. There's one interesting anecdote about driving to Maine. One day Reich said to me, "How long does it take you to drive from Philadelphia here?" And I said, "Oh, a little more than 12 hours. And he said, "Well, it takes 12 hours from New York." So I said, "Yeah, but I drive pretty fast." So he said, "You have a right to risk your own life, but you don't have a right to risk other people's lives. So unless it takes you 12 hours plus the time it takes to go from Philadelphia to New York, don't bother coming anymore." So after that, I drove more slowly, so it took me 14 hours to get to Maine instead of 12 hours. Therapy with Reich, as I say, was exhilarating. There were times that it was, of course, frightening. And there's only one time that I have ever entertained the idea of suicide. I knew I wouldn't do it, but for one brief period, the idea of suicide entered my head, which was after a session with Reich. Like that was a new experience for me, having that kind of depressed feeling, because generally I'm an up person. I don't get depressed too easily. In therapy, the thing that was unique about Reich was how he always hit the nail on the head. He just had amazing sensitivity and amazing acumen. He knew exactly where the patient was, and he knew exactly what to do in order to evoke what had to be evoked at that time. And when he did, he often said, "You will never be this good." And at times he said, "I'm the only organoist. No one else can really do therapy." And compared to Reich, it was true. We had one session that's interesting to talk about. I had come for a series of sessions voicing some cynicism. I accused him of exaggerating, a little disbelief. And at that time there were lots of stories rampant that Reich was psychotic, which I reported to him, things that I had heard, not as if I believed them, but I was just reporting them to him. So I came up for a session, and he had a rifle standing by the fireplace in the room where he treated me. And he picked up the rifle and he pointed it at my head. And he said, "I'm psychotic." And I burst out laughing because what he wanted to see was, did I really think that, did I believe these stories, or was I merely reporting them? So I burst out laughing because it just struck me so funny, the idea of a therapist putting a gun to a patient's head. And that was all he needed. Like, he laughed too, and he put the gun back. But that's how Reich got at something. He didn't monkey around. Like, if he wanted to see whether you believed he was crazy, he gave you ample chance to prove that you thought he was crazy. Another interesting thing was, there was a lot of talk, did Reich become psychotic toward the end of his life? And during one of my sessions, an airplane flew overhead. And he said, Eisenhower is sending those airplanes over to watch over me. And I said, I don't think so. I said, I think this place is just in the flight pattern of an airliner that is flying over this place. And he said, maybe. He said, we'll see. Now that is not the reaction of a psychotic. A psychotic, if he says, Eisenhower is sending that plane to watch over me, and I say, no sir, I think that's an airliner just on its ordinary flight path, he doesn't say, maybe you're right. He sticks to his guns. And the whole business of Reich's psychosis, and I do believe that many of the ideas that he expressed toward the end of his life were exaggerated, outlandish, not realistic. But I don't attribute that to psychosis. I attribute that to the kind of thinking that Reich did all his life. I think that Reich was truly one of the rare geniuses in this world. And I think that those people think by exploring all kinds of ideas that never occurred to us, that they push ideas way beyond the limits that we hold ourselves to think in. And that because of that, he came up with so many of his marvelous ideas, but that along with the marvelous ideas, there were also these cockeyed ideas, which those of us who always use common sense and are always careful to be correct would never arrive at. But he arrived at them in both a positive and a negative direction. And I think the idea of Eisenhower protecting him was an exaggerated idea in the negative direction. But it was his kind of thinking. At seminars, he was very hard on the physicians. And he sometimes would get so angry, and it was an anger such as I have never beheld. Once, I remember we were outside, and he got so angry with us, and a storm came up. And I can believe that there was a connection between the intensity of his anger and that storm, because I'd never seen such anger, and that storm came up so fast, I think he may have influenced the atmosphere. And he also could be very gentle, very sympathetic, and particularly, I remember once at the end of a seminar in Oregon that went on for probably about a week. We had a party and dance at the end. And I thought, this is going to be interesting. I've never seen Reich in this role. And I remember one lady saying, I'm so scared to go to this thing. She'd never met Reich. And he was the essence of European gentlemanliness. Like he did everything but kiss the women's hands. He was just gentle and considerate and just a perfect gentleman in that kind of situation. And, you know, when I saw him in that situation and thought of some of the storms that I'd seen him in, you know, I thought, like saying to those women, you should see him sometimes. He doesn't always act like this. The essence of therapy with Reich was truthfulness. One would never think of talking small talk with Reich. There was always an atmosphere of deep seriousness. I remember I'm a tennis player, and Reich apparently played tennis too. And I had a feeling I'd love to play him because I think I could beat him. And I'd love to beat him. But he never invited me to play tennis with, so I never got the opportunity. Wait, let's cut for a while. Let me think some more. Oh, I can remember another incident. But when you're in therapy, as the negative transference starts operating, you do all kinds of silly things. So I remember once before my session, I was standing downstairs where Reich's dining room was. And I heard him say to Peter, his son, shut up. So that was grist for my mill. So when we had my session, I said, I heard you talking to Peter, and I heard you say irritably to him, shut up. And I don't think that's how one should talk to children. So he gave me a lecture on how one talks to children. And the fact that shut up is the most direct way of accomplishing what he wanted to accomplish with Peter at that time. So, and I kind of half knew it as I was doing it, but you do things to try to irritate him. Because he's gotten you, you try to get back at him. Another time, I heard the sweetest discourse between him and Peter. And Peter wanted to know, why do you spell knife with a K? He said, it should be called knife if you spell it with a K. And I don't remember the details, but Reich gave him the sweetest discourse on why there's a K in front of the N in knife. So it was the kind of thing that was almost learned, but it was also the kind of thing that a child could easily understand. I remember a difficulty that I had at one of my sessions in Organon. I had been, before my session, speaking with Dr. Silbert. And we'd been speaking about electroshock therapy. And Silbert said to me, would you ever give a schizophrenic patient electroshock therapy? And I said yes, because I've seen schizophrenics who did, who couldn't be reached any other way. And in those days, there weren't the neuroleptics that we have today. So there was much, much less that you could do for schizophrenics in those days than you can now. And the electroshock was used pretty widely, and sometimes with very good results. So I said, yes, I would use electroshock on schizophrenic patients. And he said, you're no orgonomist, Silbert said. He said, the only people I'm interested in are the people who can be approached with orgonomy. And I thought, my God, this man is nuts. He is he's a Nazi. He's an orgonomic Nazi. And that disturbed me terribly. And so when I went in for my session, I repeated that conversation to Reich. And I repeated to him how amazed I was at Silbert's attitude. And Reich said, Silbert, that poor guy, you have to forgive him. Because if Reich had had that same attitude, that would have caused a very, very serious rupture between him and me. Yeah. But he didn't at all. There was another incident. I had been receiving some training in conventional psychiatry here with a Dr. Fried, who was he was actually a psychoanalyst, but he did eclectic psychiatry. And Fried said that he'd be interested in analyzing my dreams as I went through therapy. So that didn't seem like a very unreasonable idea to me. So I came to Reich and I said, there's a Dr. Fried who's well respected, he's a good psychiatrist, and he's been helpful to me in my training, and he wants to analyze my dreams as I go through therapy. So Reich said, absolutely no. He says, he wants to steal my stuff. So I went back to Dr. Fried and told him we couldn't do it. Do you have any questions?